Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Kishore Volodi. And from time to time, there are some things that happen within the news that's going on in our active news cycles that are so important, almost like a breaking news type of topic. And certainly over the last several months, we have seen many issues that have come up that are potentially going to impact our loved ones with Down syndrome. And whenever I have those types of questions, I know exactly where to go, and that's to the National Down Syndrome Congress and to our policy and advocacy team. And so I'm so excited to bring this podcast to you today. But before I get into the details of the podcast, I want to go ahead and have our speakers introduce themselves. So, Stephanie and Ricki, do you want to introduce yourselves and share a little bit about who you are and what you do and why you love doing it?
Well, thank you, Dr. Velati, for having us on. I'm Stephanie Smith Lee. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Co-Director for the National Down Syndrome Congress. And when I left college, I worked on Capitol Hill for about 10 years before my children were born. And Laura was born in 1982 with Down syndrome. We were very lucky that her older brother, who was 3, just happened to be going to an inclusive preschool, one of the few in the country. So we had an opportunity early on to learn about the importance of inclusion. And I became very involved in volunteering on disability issues, starting out with the PTA and then organizing advocacy efforts in Virginia, working on the reauthorization of IDEA on behalf of NDSC in the mid-90s, and later became director of the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education, and then became very interested in inclusive post-secondary education when Laura wanted to go to college.
Hmm.
And I'm very happy to be part of the NDSC policy team.
Wow, thank you,
Ricki?
Stephanie. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for that just real beautiful, lifelong kind of commitment to advocacy for and how your personal story has kind of impacted all of what you've done, which is great. Yes, Ricki, please, why don't you share a little bit about who you are, what you do, why you do it?
Well, who I am is Ricki Sabia. I'm the Senior Education Policy Advisor for the National Down Syndrome Congress. I've been working in federal education policy for over 20 years. The why I do it is my son, Steve, who is 33 years old and has Down syndrome. I've been involved in some level of advocacy since he was about 2 years old. And, the impetus is really, even though obviously he's no longer in school, is trying to make things better for the students who come after him. We hope one day parents won't have to work so hard to advocate for the inclusive education or whatever it is their child needs. And that's why both Stephanie and I think, are very passionate about it. And I'm lucky to stand on the shoulders of all the work Stephanie and Madeline Will, who is another big name in our community, all the work they have done.
Wow, that's wonderful. And thank you both really for your commitment to this work because it's so important. And without it, I think a lot of what our families, perhaps our listeners take for granted would not even be possibilities. You guys would never toot your own horns that way, but I just want our listeners to understand, like when we're talking to Stephanie and Ricki, like we're talking to people who have really been doing this work that has made such an impact to our families. So thank you both. I want to talk about obviously a lot of the things that are going on within our federal government and within the things and how that might impact us here in our local areas. But before we do that, I think it's important to kind of set a foundation, kind of an understanding of what has come before. So if Stephanie, if you don't mind, could you tell us a little bit about what is IDEA and this Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act? Like, what does it do, and what are people benefiting from currently with the IDEA?
Well, I'd be happy to. The first version of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was passed in 1975, and it was a result of parents working very hard to get education for their children. Before that, many children with intellectual disability were not allowed to go to school, and many were institutions. So since 1975, we've had this IDEA, and the main pillars of it are that if a child has a disability, starting with babies, they have an opportunity to get appropriate services and supports. A piece of this is that there are procedural safeguards, civil rights aspects of it to ensure that the children are evaluated and have the opportunity to have the education that they need. Another important aspect is parent participation. And what happens is if a child was born with a disability, or if the parent or the school suspects a child might have a disability, then they're referred for an evaluation. And the evaluation is to determine whether or not the child has a disability, and if so, do they need services. So, starting with the infants and toddlers, what we call Part C of IDEA, requires that there be a comprehensive evaluation to determine if the child's eligible. And if they are eligible for services, then an individualized family service plan is developed that includes services for the child and the family. Then, when the child gets older, we go to what's called Part B of IDEA that starts with preschool. And again, there's this requirement that children with disabilities be identified, that's called child find, and be evaluated. And if they're found to have a disability and need services, then the parents are part of what's called an IEP team that develops an individualized education program for the child. And the schools are required to provide what's called FAPE, a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And what that means is that the child is educated with other students who are not disabled to the maximum extent appropriate, and they cannot be removed from a general education class unless they can't receive a satisfactory education, even with supplementary services. So the individualized education program focuses on what that child needs um, to get the academic help, to reach their academic goals and their functional goals, and to make progress in the general education curriculum. And that's the curriculum that all children's have. And again, there's procedural safeguards to ensure that their rights are protected. And it's the responsibility of the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, in the Department of Education to monitor the states, and then the states have to monitor the local school districts to ensure that children are getting what they need. And technical assistance is provided, and if needed, enforcement is provided. Then the other part of IDEA that's important to our discussion this morning is what's called Part D of IDEA. And these are the discretionary grants that go through the Office of Special Education Programs. And these grants provide the underpinning for IDEA, technical assistance, just sharing information about best practices. There's grants that have to do with technology, universal design for learning. There's grants to states to make sure they have the personnel that are needed in the state, the teachers and the occupational therapists and so on. And parent training information centers, which are very important to parents. So that's a real quick summary of IDEA and what it does for students with disabilities.
Wow, I knew that it was a very important piece of legislation, but I actually didn't realize how all-encompassing it was. So many of those things that I knew existed, I didn't know existed because of IDEA. That's really helpful, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Ricky, anything you wanted to add to that part of our discussion, or?
Well, I think Stephanie did a great job at how comprehensive it is. And I think you make a very important point that we may take for granted a lot of the things that are in that law, and the rights of our children and our rights as parents are enshrined in this law. And it has been a fight over the years to keep things as they are. Stephanie didn't bring up about a fight in 1997 that she was a big part of to try to keep a lot of this in the law. And every time they try to amend it, there's another, and Stephanie will talk a little more about this later, there is an issue with, different groups going head to head, some of them trying to weaken it and some of them trying to strengthen it. And, so we can't take any of this for granted is basically the bottom line.
For sure, for sure. And I think one of the things I want to make sure that our listeners understand too is that, we're going to be talking about these topics, of course, but from a nonpartisan view. I think one of the things that's so cool about the NDSC is that regardless of any administration that's in place, whether it be Democrat or Republican, the NDSC is always advocating very strongly for people with Down syndrome, and education is a big part of that. But as we talk about these current things that are going on and proposed changes, Ricki, I was wondering if you might be able to just summarize a little bit, like what are some of these changes that are going on? The news, it's almost overwhelming sometimes to really understand what Department of Education and IDEA and all these changes that are going on. Like, can you maybe summarize that for our listeners?
Sure. And as part of the nonpartisan piece, it's important to know that we have worked closely with all administrations and some, regardless of which party they're under, there have been challenges and there have been wins with them. So we really deal with the policies, not with the people who are in power. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So the things that we're worried about are policies, and regardless of who's in power. So some of the things, I'm breaking this up into what has happened and what is proposed.
Okay.
And, there's a lot in the press that's like, oh, they're going to close the Department of Education. There are a lot of things that Congress would have to do that people can say they want to do. That doesn't mean that that is necessarily going to happen or happen easily. So some of the things that have already happened that regardless of whether you close the Department of Education, they have an impact on the Department of Education. And Stephanie touched a little bit on, even things that happen that aren't in schools that are at the federal level. All this underpins and supports the rights of each parent listening and each self-advocate listening, even if it's at the federal level. So it's not something to say, oh, well, this isn't really important. This is just the federal level. So half of the staff at Department of Education at the federal level has been cut already. This is huge because, all of these people support the rights that are in this law. And so we already have a problem. And I will point out a lot of what's happened is subject to litigation, and it's ongoing litigation. But as a practical matter, when you get rid of half the staff, even if ultimately the courts say you need to get them back, it's still going to make major changes going forward. The Office of Civil Rights, which is very important to us, because this is a lot of what we need, is our civil rights, and we need to be able to have an Office of Civil Rights to go to. They have had their staff majorly cut, including 7 field offices. Now, just recently, they have had to start rehiring some people as a result of one of those lawsuits. But again, how easy that will be, I don't know. A lot of the people have gone on and gotten other jobs. The Institute for Educational Sciences is a big research part of the Department of Education, including a lot of research on students with disabilities and students with significant cognitive disabilities. And they were gutted, and a lot of their grants were cut, ones that have already had years in progress. So, wasted basically money that of the work that they have already started to do. So that's a big concern, obviously. People may have heard in the press about money being withheld from the Department of Education that they were supposed to get on July 1st. And this caused major chaos because, schools didn't have the money, didn't know when they were going to get the money for programs that they already were supposed to be hiring for and setting up, and parents were relying on. With advocacy, a lot of that money was indeed sent out, but late, which was a problem. There is also another chunk of money, billions of dollars, that was supposed to be out. And now the administration is saying it will be out October 1st. But again, all these delays cause a lot of chaos. Also, we had what people might have heard as the big, beautiful bill. We call it HR1, which had cuts in a number of things, but important for this topic is a cut to Medicaid. And Medicaid, people may not think of in terms of school, but Medicaid pays for a lot of early childhood services. It also pays a lot for school nurses. It pays for therapists, who do occupational speech, physical therapy, technology. So cuts in Medicaid do have a big impact on school budgets, and then states have to try to come up with the money from elsewhere. There was also a voucher part of that bill, which gave a big tax credit to people who are putting their money into scholarship organizations. And this could really drive up the amount of people who go into private schools, which again take funding that would normally go to public schools where most of our kids are located. The proposed issues that we're concerned about is that the president puts forth, so that was a budget for, I should clarify, that was a budget for some of the things like Medicaid that are called mandatory funding. There's also discretionary funding, which is pretty much all of the education funding, and the regular the IDA funding, the regular education funding, which also supports kids with disabilities. And so that fiscal year starts September 1st for 2026, and they're supposed to have a budget in place by then. I mean, a lot of times they've done what we call a continuing resolution, which is just doing it for a little period of time because they can't get the votes together for a full year. But what we're very concerned with there is the administration proposed a budget that would block grant a big part of IDEA. And what that means is they said that money that had been for teacher training, for the parent center, training centers Stephanie spoke about, for research, for technology, for a bunch of things, including those Part D technical assistance centers that help schools and states. For example, I worked for a TIE center for a while that worked on inclusive policies and practices specifically for our students, for students with significant cognitive disabilities, and all that is disseminated nationwide. All that could potentially be lost if the president's budget is followed, and that money, including money for all the preschool money, gets sent to the states without any direction on how they have to spend it. And so that could be a huge loss in how the kind of support and money that's there for our kids. So that's a big piece of it. And we're also starting to hear reports about more grants that our people already have, grants for doing work on technical assistance centers and parent training, that they haven't received their money yet for this year, for what they were supposed to receive on July 1st or hear about in the summer. And we're concerned that that could have additional cuts. And we're working behind the scenes on that because nothing has officially happened. They've been told they're not going to get a month of money, but we don't know what's going to happen after that. So we're working behind the scenes to try to get that funding to go out. So, and then even though I've been talking about a lot of negative stuff, there is a positive thing that has happened. And I'm going to turn that over to Stephanie to talk about, because she put together a letter that was a part of the advocacy to help make this happen.
Wonderful. Yeah, Stephanie, what's been going on?
Well, you made a very important point, Dr. Velati, that at NDSC, we're very careful to be bipartisan in our approaches. I actually was appointed by President George W. Bush to be the OSEP director in his administration, and we work with everyone. And disability and special education have always been bipartisan. These proposals that Ricki has mentioned to so-called block grant IDEA, there also has been a proposal to close the Department of Education and to move the Office of Special Education to another agency. I contacted all of the living former assistant secretaries for special education and OSEP directors like myself. And we had a letter signed by officials from every Republican and Democratic administration going back to Nixon, of officials who were responsible for overseeing IDEA. And we all signed a letter to Congress requesting that they reject these proposals to close the Department of Education, to move the Office of Special Education Programs, and to block grant IDEA. Along with that, NDSC's been has had a very active grassroots effort through our National Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition to have members contact their members of Congress. And we're very pleased that this advocacy has worked, at least for the initial step. The Senate Appropriations Committee voted on this appropriations bill for the funding for the department that would start October 1, and they rejected the administration proposals to close the department, move OSEP, or block grant IDEA. Now, that's just the first step. The full Senate, when they come back in session in September, they'll need to vote on the bill. And there's also the House Appropriations Committee, and the full House will have to vote. So it's very important that people keep contacting their members of Congress. We'll share a link with you, Dr. Velati. They can go in your show notes, a link to an action alert on this topic. And we also have put out like a 3-page brief that explains why the Department of Education is essential and why IDEA is essential. And we'll share a link to that too. And that's something that folks can share with their members of Congress.
Oh, that'll be great. Yeah. Wow. It's amazing how many different things are proposed and things that have already gone through, or at least in the preliminary phases of that. Stephanie, let me like when we're thinking about some of the supports and services that people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities will receive, what might be impacted by these changes that Ricki was outlining for us?
Well, that's a good question, because it's sometimes hard to look at a big picture, what's happening at the federal level, and think about how that might affect my child.
Yeah.
And the the, the effects are long term. They may not be immediate, but they are important. And
Mhm.
one of the things that really concerns me is that as less funding is available, as these huge cuts to Medicaid impact the funds that local school districts have, we're already seeing real tensions at the local level about how funding will be provided for therapy, for instance. Will money be transferred from the general education budget to the special education budget? Will taxes be raised? This kind of tension, it is not good for
Mhm.
students. It's not good for parents. We saw this in the mid 90s. Ricki mentioned the big battle over IDEA reauthorization in the mid 90s. And at that time, some of the education groups had a really negative media campaign about children with disabilities being too expensive, creating discipline problems. Now, we were able over a 3-year period to get agreement on a really good bill that ended up passing in 1997. But those kind of tensions about are kids with disabilities too expensive? I felt that as a parent of a child
Mhm.
in schools, and that's not good.
Yeah.
The proposal to block grant these Part D funds for the technical assistance centers and so on, that really will have a long-term negative impact if that should happen. We have wonderful experts who run these various centers. They do this through federal grants, and they really are the underpinning for IDEA. They create the technical assistance, and they share the information about how do you best educate these students. The parent training and information centers are federally funded. There's at least one in every state. There's
Mhm.
also community parent resource centers that focus specifically on families who may not speak English, who are living in poverty. These are really important centers that help families understand, what is my child entitled to? How do I work collaboratively with the schools to get my child what they need? These could all go away if the money doesn't go directly to them and just goes to the states to use as they wish. The preschool funding is also so important. If they block grant that and send it to the states to use how they wish, that could impact funding for preschools. So those are a few of the things that are really disturbing. And another proposal that we haven't talked about that is being discussed and hopefully won't go forward is a proposal to reauthorize IDEA. And what reauthorize means is part of IDEA is permanently authorized. It's a permanent law, but parts of it uh, are only for a certain number of years, and the time is expired. Now, Congress can still keep funding these things, but every so often they look at examining the law and seeing what's need to be changed. And it would be a very bad idea if Congress decided to reauthorize IDEA now. We've had some big battles in the past over reauthorization, and now is not a good time to open up the law for reauthorization. That's something we're very concerned about.
Hmm. So you're talking about having like an optimal timing for that reauthorization to be done.
Yeah, not
Yeah,
now, not
yeah,
next year,
yeah,
not in the next few years. We don't
yeah.
need to reauthorize it. The issues with the law are not with the law, they're with the way the law is implemented.
Got it. Okay. Wow, I can't imagine how much work is needed to be done on a day-to-day basis for you both, and the level of importance of that work. Ricki, would you mind, like, as you think about the advocacy work that's being done at the federal level, just share with our listeners a little bit about how some of these changes might impact the advocacy work that's being done.
I think that what's really important, I mean, we will go on doing the work we've always done, advocating with the Department of Education, advocating with Congress. That doesn't change behind the scenes, whatever. But what we need more than ever are people out there to participate in that advocacy, because really it's when people hear from their constituents, and that's probably a big part of why that Senate appropriations bill turned out to be favorable to us, is because some people were willing to stand up and speak out against some of the proposals, because they were hearing at home that this is going to hurt your constituents. So it is very important for anybody who's on here who is involved already to keep being involved, step it up. Anybody who isn't, to think about what they can do to be involved. And this can be at any level of comfort. So on the national level, we have a National Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition, which Stephanie mentioned. You can find it on our website, but we can also provide a link for the show notes about that. And we have a Facebook page where you get information. We have quarterly calls to update people about all these things, and also send out information specific to your state. We also have action alerts that's important for you to look out for and to sign up for. And they're very simple because it's already all set up for you, set up so you can find who your people are that you need to send it to. It really doesn't take a lot of time, but it can be very impactful. Develop relationships with the elected officials. I mean, and that can start in your local school district, at your school board. Speak at the school board meetings, meet your school board members, explain to them how important all this is. Speak against this concept that our kids are burdens on the school system, and how important it is for everybody, for the education of all students. Talk to your state legislators, because ultimately a lot of these changes are going to cause financial issues in the state, and they're going to be the ones to decide whether they're going to pull money, where they're going to pull money from. Are they going to keep funding education at the same level or not? And so state legislators are important. And of course, members of Congress, you meet with them, they come back, you don't have to come to DC, they come back home, and you can meet up with them, and you can bring your child and explain, this is a real person, and this is how this is going to impact this person now and in the years to come. So all that is very important. A lot of people, it's not mean-spiritedness. They do not understand, a lot of them, the impact. They don't have a child or a family member with a disability, and they don't fully see, they get told, oh, this isn't going to really hurt him, we're going to still protect them. And they don't see the ways in which this can, even inadvertently, be a big, bad issue for families and students with disabilities. And some people say to me, well, I live in a state where my senators and congressmen and everybody are all on board. They're doing what you're saying. What can I do? Well,
Mhm.
we all have family members and friends who live all around the country, especially in this age of social media. We're connected everywhere. And, a lot of those people in our lives, even though they know us, may not understand. And I do this with my own friends and family. They don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of what made Steve have a good education, what helps him as an adult live independently and have a job. And so I get out there and explain to them, these are the policies and the proposals that could hurt his ability to continue to live the life he has. And so that they can, in their state, where it may make more of a difference, do that advocacy. So, all those things I think are particularly important right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and so much of that is just one of those beautiful benefits of living in a country where people have to listen to their constituents and hear our concerns and bring those things forward and these are things again like even big picture we take for granted sometimes, but it's so important for our voices to be heard. So thank you, Ricki, for that summary. Stephanie, anything you would want to add in terms of like a summary of things that we've talked about today or important take home points that you would want our listeners to know?
Well, I think one of the most important points to think about is you don't have to be an expert on IDEA or Medicaid or whatever to speak to a school board member or a state legislator or a member of Congress or their staff. All you need to know is your own story and share your own story about why something is important to you and your family. And oftentimes people don't realize that they really can make a difference. And we've seen over and over with this law and with others that individual people talking to their policy members, contacting them, letting them know how something impacts them does and can make a difference. And it is critically important for people to be involved in that. And I would just add that I would hope that many of your listeners are planning on coming to the NDSC convention in Orlando next July. And at the convention, we have a half-day advocacy training boot camp, which is a terrific way for beginners to understand how to tell your story and how to make an impact. And thank you for addressing this very important topic today.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Thank you both for agreeing to come on. I know you're both very busy people and I really appreciate you sharing this information. Actually, to our listeners, this is going to be a really a two-part series. This is part one, but part two we will be looking at the Medicaid changes also with some folks from the policy and advocacy team from NDSC with Heather Sachs and Jawanda Mast. So stay tuned for that episode as that comes out. But to both of you again, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Dr. Velati, for the opportunity.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, and to our listeners, I hope you found this podcast as educational as I did. And that's the all pun intended. And I really, really do hope that you take this information that we've learned today and be able to share that with your local and governmental officials, both regionally, state, federal officials, things people who want to hear what you have to say. You have a unique experience that you can share that others may not know as deeply as you do if you have a loved one with Down syndrome. But if you have other topics also that you would like us to cover or want us to go into deeper detail with any topics, please do send me an email at downsyndromecenter@chp.edu. And if you'd like to join the work that we do here at the Down Syndrome Center, including this podcast, please go to givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center. But until next time, bye-bye.